Minh Thúy xin kính chào quý vị hôm nay thứ Sáu, 12 tháng 4, 2024. Đến với VATV hôm nay gồm có phỏng vấn đặc biệt và nhạc lá bồ đề. Kính thưa quý vị, tại sao chính quyền Johnson không được tin tưởng như chính quyền Kennedy? Tại sao chỉ trong một thời gian ngắn ngủi, chính quyền Johnson lại đánh mất những uy tín chính quyền Kennedy đã tạo dựng? Tại sao giới truyền thông lại nghi ngờ chính quyền Johnson và dần dần đứng vào thế gần như đối nghịch? Giữa khi giới truyền thông đang bước vào thế đối lập với chính quyền và sau cú giáng Tết Mậu Thân của Bắc Việt, chàng thanh niên trẻ Lacy Wright được chỉ định công tác ở Việt Nam. Minh Thúy mời quý vị tiếp tục theo dõi những biến động ở Hoa Kỳ vào cuối thập niên 60, cùng tiếp tục theo dõi những suy nghĩ, giải thích của ông Lacy Wright trong những bối cảnh của thập niên đó và cảm tưởng của ông trước khi được chỉ định công tác ở Việt Nam. Trong phần 3 do Phan Lê Dũng, Võ Thành Nhân và Minh Thúy thực hiện.
What do you think is the main cause of the changing of view going from Kennedy administration into Johnson's administration, that people have a lot of hope and believe in going out and service and everything, and all of a sudden they are against the government? So what make the attitude switching around from one position to the opposite position in such a short time between the two administrations?
I believe it was probably because our government and principally with regard to the Vietnam War, was caught not always telling the truth. In our zeal to win the war, I'm afraid our government was tempted and often gave in to the temptation to paint things much more optimistically than they were. And of course all that exploded at the time of the Tet Offensive, which is really terribly ironic, because by all accounts the South Vietnamese won the Tet Offensive, and yet in the United States our government's credibility was badly damaged, and I don't think during the war, the government never recovered from that.
There seems to be a struggle between the so-called journalists and the administration. The administration is accusing that the journalists are not reporting the truth, whereas the journalists are saying that all the information coming from administration is not true. Struggle kept going on. Would you say it's part of the media that created the loss of faith in the American people about the war and about Vietnam War specifically?
Well, they certainly had a role. Don't forget that not all by any means, but a large number of journalists and the most famous journalists were against the war.
Were they right?
Pardon me?
Were they right?
Well, I guess it depends on what what subject you're talking about. They were, of course, against the dissembling that our government often did in its public statements about the war, and you can't blame them for that. But I think also they took on the view, many of them took on the view, that the communists were the better party. The communists were stronger and would win anyway. The South Vietnamese were often corrupt and had in the view of some people, a tenuous claim on the leadership of South Vietnam and all that. And I think those kinds of, and don't forget, there were some very influential books at the time that espoused this view. Fire in the Lake is maybe the most prominent of them.
Yes.
And that impacted a lot of people.
But Define the Lake came out in 1972, not 1968, 1962, or 1965, when American involvement is already there. So you're talking about 1972 as well.
Well, that's true, but it encapsulated the view that was growing among the press and other people about that time, I would say.
What about you? What's your impression about the time that the American come into the war? Were you holding the popular view, or do you have any personal view at that time?
Well, I think I was holding 1965. You say?
Yes.
Popular view, I would say.
And what year did you come to Vietnam?
I came first. I was there twice. I came first in the May of 1969.
69. That's the first time you went to Vietnam. So that's already after Tet.
Yeah, that was about a year after Tet.
What's your impression when you got into the country?
Well, the first, when we were being prepared to go to Vietnam.
How are you prepared?
First of all, I entered the Foreign Service in January of 1968. So for the first 4 months, I was in a orientation course for the Foreign Service. Then I was assigned to Vietnam. Then I went into the Vietnam Training Center for training to go to Vietnam, most of which was language training. And then I finally went to Vietnam in, as I said, in April or May of 1969.
69. How do you find the country? How does it feel to you? What's your expectation before coming to Vietnam? Any specific expectation coming to the country, and what kind of job would you do? How you
I'm sorry to say that my first concern about arriving in Vietnam was that I not be killed, and it took a few weeks for me to look around and realize that was not very likely. Not likely at all. But when you're looking at things from afar, naturally, all of us who were assigned to who had been assigned to Vietnam, we all had to have that in mind. I don't want to get killed in Vietnam. A lot of people were getting killed in Vietnam, Americans.
Yes.
But I quickly saw that the kind of work, the kind of places that we were in, and the kind of work that we were doing, were not likely to result in our deaths. And of course, we were right. In fact, the people who went to Vietnam, most were like me. They went through their whole time there, and nothing damaging ever happened to them. Nonetheless, a lot of Foreign Service officers were killed in Vietnam, mostly I think, around the Tet Offensive, because they all of a sudden found themselves in the midst of a shooting war. But for most of us, that did not happen. And by the way, I think it's interesting to note this. Even though the Foreign Service officers and other civilians participated in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, very, very few got killed or injured. Many more in Vietnam. And I think that is because in Vietnam, we were really, as civilians, we were really allowed to be on our own. You, of course, were expected to display some common sense, not go into places where they were dangerous, and you quickly learned in the Mekong Delta, for example, where those places were and where they weren't. And so you sort of self-regulated. When you got to Afghanistan, though, and Iraq, there was a whole different security atmosphere and a whole new concern for the security of our diplomats abroad. The good news from that is that very few were killed, almost none. The bad news is that they were very much discouraged from going out in the field and doing reporting of the kind that we did in Vietnam.
Minh Thúy xin kính chào quý vị hôm nay thứ Sáu, 19 tháng 4, 2024. Đến với VATV hôm nay gồm có phỏng vấn đặc biệt và nhạc lá bồ đề. Kính thưa quý vị, huấn luyện cho các nhân viên Mỹ trước khi gửi họ sang công tác ở Việt Nam là một quá trình quan trọng của chính phủ Mỹ. Những cuộc huấn luyện đó không những chỉ về ngôn ngữ mà còn về văn hóa, xã hội, lịch sử của Việt Nam. Trong phần phỏng vấn kỳ này thì Minh Thúy mời quý vị theo dõi những nhận định của ông Lacy Wright và những giải thích của ông vì sao các nhân viên của Sở Ngoại vụ thường lưu loát tiếng Việt, trong khi rất ít cố vấn quân sự lưu loát tiếng Việt. Tuy họ cũng được đào tạo trong những khóa học y hệt như nhau. Sau các cuộc huấn luyện thì họ thường được chỉ định công tác như thế nào? Thi hành công tác ra sao? Tường trình thế nào với thượng cấp? Minh Thúy mời quý vị theo dõi công tác chính của các nhân viên Sở Ngoại vụ qua các việc làm cụ thể hàng ngày khi họ công tác ở Việt Nam. Trong phần 4 phỏng vấn đặc biệt do Phan Lê Dũng, Võ Thành Nhân và Minh Thúy thực hiện.
Back at the question of training, you said that before you came to Vietnam, there was a training period. First to be a foreign service, and then later, specifically linguistically, Vietnamese. Would you say that these training give you enough orientation and enough about Vietnam before you came to Vietnam?
You know, when you're in training, it's hard to visualize what you're actually going to be involved in when you get there. So I think you have to take that into account. On the other hand, the language training was superb. Now, the State Department at that time put on a huge effort to teach people Vietnamese. And there were a number of us from the Foreign Service in that. There were from USAID, probably a few from the CIA, and a number of military officers. And out of that, some people did not do well. If they didn't do well, they were sent earlier to Vietnam. So there was that was an extra added incentive to study your lessons. But I would say that as I look back on it and look back upon the people who went there were a very large handful of Foreign Service officers and others who really spoke excellent Vietnamese. So I think probably that's something that has slipped below the radar for most people. You know, the United States is often criticized for sending its diplomats into places where they don't speak the language. I would say by and large that criticism is unfounded. I would say that in most countries, and certainly in Vietnam, among all of the diplomats of foreign countries who were there, the Americans were number one in speaking the language, certainly in Vietnam and probably in most places in the world, because we have a very good language school, and the State Department puts a lot of emphasis on teaching languages.
What about other aspects, like the cultural aspect, the societal aspect? Like when you look to Vietnam, do they give you the view of the country and how you should behave and all that?
Yeah, they did all that, and they taught us about Tet, and they taught us about other kinds of customs of the Vietnamese. And I think that the people who probably benefited from that the most were those of us who were sent down to live at the province and district levels. They were able to see that right away. And by the way, they were the people who, by and large, turned out to be speaking excellent Vietnamese for very good reason. They were immersed in the language right away. On the other hand, the military officers among us, almost none learned to speak Vietnamese. I don't think that's because they were not smart or they didn't try. It was because once they went to Vietnam, immediately they were almost all cast as advisors to Vietnamese officers. So they arrived, they met their counterpart officer. Their counterpart would have spoken some English, and they would have kept speaking English until the time they left. I can only think, in my own experience, I can only think of one American military officer who really spoke Vietnamese. There were probably more, but in my experience, only one.
And how do they assign you once when you graduate from those courses, from the training?
Well, they had a list of, naturally, of all of the jobs out there and which ones were coming open. For in my own, and most of the people who went there from my class and other classes were put into corps after 1967. That's when corps started, which, as you know, is what civil operations and rural development support. The half military, half civilian.
It's the first time they incorporate the two into one.
Yes,
to make it uniformly,
time.
right?
And so most people went to corps. I did not. I was nothing to do with me. It's just what I was assigned. I was assigned to the U.S. Embassy and to the political section, and within the political section to a unit which was called the Provincial Reporting Unit. The political section at that time had two positions for each of the four corps. And I was one of the two people who was sent to 4 Corps, the Mekong Delta. So therefore, I lived part of the time in Kanta and part of the time in Saigon, about half and half, really. So my job, even though I was dealing with corps people all the time, my job bureaucratically was different.
And how describe to us what your daily duty, normally what you do from day to day?
It was very amorphous. Our overall job was to go out and report back things to the embassy that would be of interest, concentrating, because we were civilians, concentrating on the political situation. So we had to learn all about the different non-communist political parties in Vietnam, of which there were a number. We needed to learn about the Wahao, about the Cao Dai, and other, the Montagnard, and other political forces in South Vietnam. So we did a lot of reporting on them. We reported on the progressive nationalist movement of Professor Bohm, for example, which was held in very high regard by the embassy, which saw it as a chance to, as a grouping of very attractive people, teachers, other kinds of people who were idealistic, who were non-communist but also clean, also had very high hopes for the advancement of South Vietnam as a country. So that movement was held in very high regard, and the embassy followed it very closely. We had, for example, a man named Dick Thompson at in the embassy political section in Saigon, who followed Professor Bohm and Nguyen Ngọc Huy around all the time and reported on what they were doing. So we were boosters of them. We hoped they would succeed.